I still hear her voice in my nightmares. That night, I saw something no child should ever see. My name is Dapo. I was 14 when it happened. We lived in a small village in Nigeria. My dad, my stepmom, and me. My real mom died when I was a baby, so I never really knew her. But my dad always spoke of her like she was some kind of angel. After she passed, he remarried when I was 6, and that when everything changed. At first, my stepmom Mama Tinu seemed nice, too nice. She'd always bring me sweets, pat me on the head, and tell my dad what a good boy I was. But it was all fake. I could feel it even as a kid. When dad wasn't around, she would hardly look at me. If she did, it was with these sharp, cold eyes, like I was something she couldn't stand. Over time, I learned to keep my distance. The whispers started when I turned 13. Late at night, when I was supposed to be asleep, I'd hear her talking, low and urgent. I'd press my ear to the wall, but I could never make out what she was saying. It sounded like she was arguing with someone, but there was never anyone else in the house. At first, I thought she was on the phone, but one night, when I finally gathered the courage to pick, there was no phone. She was sitting in the dark, rocking back and forth, talking to the air. It got worse after that. Strange things began happening around the house. Pots would fall from shelves even though no one touched them. I'd wake up with scratches on my arms and legs, deep ones, like I'd been clawed. I asked my dad about it, but he just laughed it off, saying I must have scratched myself in my sleep. I knew better. But the worst night, the night I can never forget, came when my dad had to travel for work. It was just me and Mama Tinu in the house. I remember everything about that evening. The rain had started falling just after sunset, and the power went out soon after. I was in my room, lying on my bed, listening to the heavy drop hit the tin roof. I tried to read with a small torchlight, but my mind was elsewhere. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That's when I heard the humming, low, almost like a chant. It was coming from the living room. My skin crawled. I thought about staying in bed, pretending I hadn't heard it, but my legs moved on their own. Quietly, I slipped out of bed and tiptoed down the hallway. I was careful not to make any noise. Something deep inside me knew I shouldn't be caught. The house felt different, the air was thick, and the shadows seemed wrong. It was as if they were moving, crawling along the walls. I told myself it was just the flickering light from my torch, but deep down, I knew something terrible was waiting. I stopped just before the living room and peered around the corner. That's when I saw her. Mama Tinu was sitting on the floor, her back to me. In front of her was a large clay pot I had never seen before, placed in the center of the room. The room was dimly lit by a single candle that flickered wildly. The pot was huge, almost as tall as her knees, and from where I stood I could see something moving inside. The humming was coming from her, a strange, hypnotic tune that made my chest tighten with fear. Then she started talking. Her voice was low and raspy, speaking a language I didn't understand. It wasn't Yoruba, not Hausa, nothing familiar. The words felt wrong, like they didn't belong in this world. Slowly, she reached into the pot and pulled out a small black bird. It had no eyes, just empty holes where they should have been. The bird writhed in her hands, squawking in a horrible, shrill voice, but she didn't flinch. She squeezed it until the bird went limp, and then, with a calmness that made my stomach churn, she dipped her fingers into the bird's blood and smeared it across her forehead, her arms, and down her chest. I gasped. I couldn't help it. The sound was small, but in that dead silence, it was like an explosion. She froze. I quickly ducked behind the wall, praying she hadn't seen me. My heart pounded so hard I was sure she could hear it. I wanted to run, to get out of that house, but my legs wouldn't move. The humming stopped, and all I could hear was the sound of the rain outside and my own heavy breathing. I peeked again, just for a second. She was standing now, her back still to me, but something was different. She wasn't normal anymore. Her spine was bent at an unnatural angle, her arms longer, too long. Her fingers, stretched into sharp claws, twitched at her sides. She turned her head slowly, so slowly, and I saw her face. It wasn't her face anymore. Her skin was darker, almost gray, like it had been burnt. Her eyes, once brown, were now completely black. No whites, no pupils, just deep, endless pits. Her mouth stretched unnaturally wide, revealing rows of jagged, yellow teeth. And her neck, it twisted, like it didn't have bones, rotating until her head was completely upside down. I felt bile rise in my throat. She sniffed the air, her head turning toward me, even though her body stayed still. "Dapo," she said, her voice dripping with malice. "I know you're there." My heart stopped. I backed away, my hands shaking so hard I almost dropped my torch. I had to get out. I had to run. But before I could move, she took a step toward me. Her body jerked forward, like a puppet being dragged on strings. "I've been waiting for this," she hissed, her voice growing louder. "You're next." I turned and bolted. I didn't care about being quiet anymore. I ran down the hallway, through the front door and into the night. The rain pounded down on me, soaking me to the bone. But I didn't stop. I could hear her behind me, her footsteps heavy and uneven, like she was dragging herself across the ground. I didn't dare look back. I ran straight to my uncle's house at the far end of the village. I banged on the door, screaming for him to let me in. When he opened it, his face went pale. He knew something was wrong. I collapsed into his arms, gasping for air. She's not human," I stammered. He didn't ask questions. He just locked the door and sat me down, handing me a towel to dry off. When I finally caught my breath, I told him everything. He listened quietly, his face growing more serious with every word. When I finished, he didn't laugh or tell me I was imagining things. Instead, he nodded and stood up. He opened a small wooden chest in the corner of the room and pulled out a bundle of leaves and a small bottle of what looked like oil. "There are things," he said quietly, "that live among us, things we do not understand. But I believe you, Dapo. Mama Tinu, she's not one of us anymore." I stayed with my uncle that night, but I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, those black empty eyes staring back at me. The next morning, my dad came back. I begged him to take me with him, to leave the village, but he didn't listen. He thought I was just having bad dreams, that I was making up stories because I missed him when he was gone. I never went back to that house. My uncle wouldn't allow it, and I didn't argue. A few weeks later, Mama Tinu disappeared. No one knew where she went, and no one in the village seemed to care. My dad acted like everything was normal, like she had just gone on a trip, but I knew better. I've never seen her since. But sometimes late at night, when the rain is falling and the wind is howling through the trees, I still hear her voice. "Dapo, I know you're there." For a long time after she disappeared, I convinced myself that she was gone for good. My uncle even performed some kind of ritual to keep me safe. He burned those leaves he had pulled out of the chest, muttering prayers over me, his voice steady and strong. I could still hear the flames crackling as he circled me with smoke. It felt comforting, like a shield wrapping itself around me, keeping the evil away. But even then, in the back of my mind, I knew something wasn't right. The way she vanished without a trace didn't feel like the end of her. I could still feel her presence, like she was lurking, waiting for the right moment to return. I tried to move on with my life. I started attending school again, playing football with the boys in the village, doing everything I could to pretend that night never happened. But there were signs, small things that reminded me she was still out there. It started with the dreams. They weren't just nightmares. They were too real. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd see her standing at the foot of my bed, her body twisted, her eyes those black, endless pits, staring into me. She would smile, that wicked, jagged grin, and whisper, "I haven't forgotten you, Dapo." I'd wake up drenched in sweat, heart pounding, and every time the room felt colder, like something was watching me. I told my uncle about the dreams, but he insisted the ritual had worked. He told me to pray, to stay strong, and that whatever power she had over me was broken. But I could see it in his eyes. He wasn't sure. The dreams became more vivid over the next few months. Sometimes I'd wake up with the same deep scratches on my arms and legs, just like before. Other times, I'd hear a voice calling my name from outside the window. I refused to look, terrified I might actually see her standing there, waiting in the shadows. Then, one night, something happened that confirmed my worst fears. It was a quiet evening, and my uncle had gone to visit a neighbor, leaving me alone in the house. I tried to distract myself, reading by the dim lantern light, but as the night wore on, that familiar sense of dread started creeping in. The room grew colder, and the shadows seemed to stretch, swallowing the corners of the room. And then, just as I was about to turn in for the night, I heard it, a faint tapping at the window. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the tapping was too rhythmic, too deliberate. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I wanted to ignore it, to pretend I hadn't heard anything, but the tapping got louder, more insistent. Against my better judgment, I slowly turned toward the window. There, pressed against the glass, was a hand, not a normal hand. It was gray, twisted, with long claw-like fingers. My blood ran cold. I knew that hand. I had seen it before, dragging itself across the floor the night she changed. I scrambled back from the window, trying to keep myself from screaming. The hand started scratching at the glass, slow and deliberate, like it was testing the barrier between us. I could hear her voice, muffled but clear. "Dapo, let me in." I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was trapped, frozen in place as she whispered my name again and again. The scratching grew louder, more desperate, and I could see her distorted figure now, a shadowy silhouette outside the window, her head twisted at that impossible angle, staring directly at me. "I haven't forgotten you, Dapo." Finally, my body responded. I grabbed the lantern and bolted out of the house, running straight into the night. I didn't stop until I reached the village square, where the elders often gathered. There was a small group of them still there, sitting around the fire, discussing village matters. I must have looked like I'd seen a ghost because they all stood up immediately, their faces filled with concern. I stammered, trying to explain what had just happened. I could barely get the words out, but they understood enough. One of the older men, Baba Kola, stepped forward. He was known as the village's wise man, someone who had knowledge of things most people feared. He listened intently as I described the hand, the voice, and the scratching at the window. When I finished, Baba Kola didn't look surprised. He just nodded solemnly and motioned for me to sit by the fire. "This is not the first time such a thing has happened," he said in a low voice. "Your stepmother, she was never truly human after the day she crossed into dark magic. She belongs to another world now, one that has rules we don't understand." I felt a shiver run down my spine. I had always known something was wrong with her, but hearing it from Baba Kola made it feel final, inescapable. "She has not forgotten you, Dapo," he continued, his voice steady but filled with warning. "She marked you, and she will not stop until she gets what she came for." I swallowed hard, my mind racing. What does she want from me?" Baba Kola's eyes darkened. "Your soul." I felt like the ground had dropped beneath me. My soul. This wasn't just about scaring me or haunting me in my dreams. She wanted to take something far more valuable. "She feeds on the souls of those she marks," Baba Kola explained. "It gives her power and keeps her tied to this world. But there is a way to stop her." I leaned forward, desperate for any solution. How do we stop her?" "There is an ancient ritual," he said, "but it's dangerous. It requires facing her, confronting her in the place she drew her power from." I knew immediately what he meant. The clay pot. That was the source of her strength, the connection she had to the dark forces she served. But the thought of going back to that house, back to where I had seen her change, filled me with dread I couldn't describe. Still, I had no choice. I couldn't live in fear forever, waiting for her to find me and take me. The next night, with Baba Kola's guidance, I returned to the house. We prepared for the ritual, gathering the necessary items, herbs, oil, and the carved wooden figurine meant to represent me. Baba Kola smeared the oil on my forehead and hand, chanting prayers under his breath. He handed me the figurine and told me to hold it tight, to never let go, no matter what happened. As we entered the house, the air grew thick and suffocating. The shadows seemed to reach for me, twisting and writhing along the walls. Baba Kola lit a small fire in the center of the living room, just in front of where the clay pot had once stood. Then, from the darkness, I heard her. "Dapo, you've come back?" Her voice slithered through the air, sending chills down my spine. I could feel her before I saw her. She was close, so close. And then she appeared, stepping out from the shadows, her body twisted, her eyes black and endless. "You cannot escape me," she hissed, her voice filled with malice. "You are mine!" But Baba Kola stood firm, his chants growing louder as he threw herbs into the fire. The flames flared up, casting a bright, blinding light across the room. I held the figurine tight, my heart pounding in my chest as her form flickered and distorted. She lunged at me, her claws outstretched, but before she could reach me, Baba Kola threw a handful of powder into the flames. There was a loud crack, like thunder, and she let out a scream that pierced the night. Her body twisted violently, her limbs contorting as she was pulled back into the shadows, back into the darkness from which she had come. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The house was silent, the air still. Baba Kola placed a hand on my shoulder. "It is done," he said quietly. "She will not return." I wanted to believe him, and for the most part, I did. But even now, years later, every time it rains, every time the wind howls through the trees, I can still hear her voice, faint and distant. "Dapo, Asa, I haven't forgotten you." And deep down, I know she's still out there, waiting. Even though Baba Kola assured me it was over, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still watching me from somewhere in the shadows. Life moved on, but the fear lingered in the corners of my mind, creeping in when I was alone, or when night fell. For months after the ritual, things were quiet. I didn't hear her voice or see her twisted form lurking in the shadows. The scratches stopped, and I began to sleep better. My uncle told me that the worst was behind me, that I had faced the darkness and survived. But something inside me told me not to be so sure. One evening, just as the sun was setting, my dad returned to the village. I hadn't seen him since before the night I fled the house, and when he came to my uncle's door, I felt a mixture of relief and dread. He smiled as if nothing was wrong, as if he hadn't noticed the way I'd been avoiding home for months. He didn't ask questions, didn't even mention Mama Tinu's disappearance. He acted like she had simply moved away, like she hadn't just vanished from our lives without explanation. "Dapo," he said, his voice calm, "it's time to come home." I froze. I hadn't stepped foot in that house since the ritual, and the thought of going back made my stomach churn. But my dad was insistent. He told me things had changed and that it was time to move on. He didn't understand what had happened, and I could see in his eyes that he never truly believed my story. To him, Mama Tinu had left, nothing more. Reluctantly, I agreed. I couldn't avoid home forever. The next morning, we returned to the house. It was quiet, too quiet. The walls felt heavy with memories I didn't want to relive. Everything looked the same, but I could feel the weight of what had happened here, like the air was still thick with the presence of something dark. As we settled back in, I tried to convince myself that things were okay and that Baba Kola's ritual had truly worked. But there were little things I couldn't ignore. The wind howled more fiercely around the house than it did anywhere else in the village. The floorboards creaked even when no one was walking on them. Sometimes I could feel the temperature drop suddenly, for no reason at all. And then, one night, it happened again. It was raining. Hard, just like the night I first saw her. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to push away the memories. I told myself that it was just a storm, nothing more. But deep down, I knew better. I could feel it, that familiar dread, creeping in slowly. I closed my eyes, willing myself to sleep. But then, I heard it. Tap, tap, tap. The sound came from the window, just like before. At first, I tried to ignore it. Maybe it was just a branch hitting the glass, I told myself. But the tapping didn't stop. It grew louder, more persistent. Tap, tap, tap. My heart raced. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see what I knew was waiting for me on the other side of the window. But then, a voice. Dapo? It was soft, barely more than a whisper, but it sent chills down my spine. Dapo, I haven't forgotten you. I bolted upright in bed, my breath catching in my throat. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it would burst. I stared at the window, terrified to move, terrified to breathe. Then, slowly, the shadow appeared. At first, it was just a dark outline, but as the lightning flashed outside, I saw her face pressed against the glass, her eyes black and hollow, her twisted smile spread wide across her face. I'm still here, she whispered, her voice crawling into my ears like poison, and I always will be. I tried to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. I backed away from the window, shaking, tears filling my eyes. I grabbed the figurine Babacola had given me, clutching it so tightly my knuckles turned white. Suddenly, the window burst open and the cold wind rushed into the room, carrying with it the scent of something rotting, something foul and ancient. The candle on my bedside table flickered, the light almost extinguished by the gust. She stepped into the room, her body distorted, her limbs jerking as she moved toward me. Her head was still twisted at that unnatural angle, her eyes fixed on me, unblinking. Did you really think you could be free of me? She hissed, her voice low and dangerous. I'm a part of you now, Dapo, forever. I backed into the corner of the room, trapped. The walls seemed to close in on me, and I felt the weight of her presence pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. She reached out a clawed hand, her fingers stretching toward me, just inches from my face. I could feel the cold radiating from her, and my whole body trembled. You're mine, she whispered, her lips curling into that horrible grin. No ritual can save you. No prayer can protect you. In that moment, I remembered something Babacola had told me, something he had warned me about. The ritual had worked, but only as long as I believed in it. Fear, he said, would weaken the protection. The moment I let my fear take over, she could find a way back. I squeezed the figurine tighter, closing my eyes, trying to calm my racing heart. I'm not afraid of you, I whispered, though my voice shook. She laughed, a cruel, mocking sound that made my skin crawl. You lie, Dapo. I can smell your fear. But I kept my eyes shut, focusing on the warmth of the figurine in my hand, reminding myself of the power Babacola had given me. You have no power over me, I said, louder this time. You're nothing. Her laughter faded, replaced by a low growl. I could feel the air around me growing colder, the pressure building, but I refused to open my eyes. You're nothing, I repeated, my voice steady now. You don't belong here. The growling intensified, but I kept going, chanting the words Babacola had taught me under my breath. The coldness around me started to fade, the room becoming warmer, the pressure lifting. Suddenly, I heard a scream, a high-pitched, piercing wail that made my ears ring. The wind stopped, the foul scent disappeared, and when I opened my eyes, she was gone. The window was closed again, the room calm, as if nothing had happened. I collapsed onto the floor, gasping for breath, my body trembling. I held the figurine close, thanking Babacola for his wisdom. She was gone for now, but I knew she wasn't defeated. I could still feel her, lurking somewhere in the shadows, waiting for another moment of weakness. From that night on, I carried the figurine with me everywhere I went. I refused to let fear control me. Babakola was right. The only way to keep her at bay was to stay strong, to believe in the power of the ritual, and to never let her back into my life. But deep down, I knew the truth. She would never truly be gone, not as long as I lived. And every time the wind howled or the rain tapped against the window, I'd be reminded of her chilling words. I haven't forgotten you, Dapo. And I knew, somewhere, out there, she was still waiting. As I sit here, telling you this, I still can't believe I survived it all. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that she's still out there, waiting. Some nights, when the wind howls just right or the rain taps against the window, I hear her voice in the back of my mind. Dapo, I haven't forgotten you. Even after all of these years, I live in fear that one day she'll return. That one day I'll wake up and she'll be there, standing at the foot of my bed, smiling that twisted, wicked smile. I still carry that figurine everywhere, clinging to it like it's my last defense. Because I know the truth. She's never really gone. She's just waiting for me to sleep, for the fear to creep back in. And when it does, she'll be there, ready to take what she's been after all along. If there's anything I've learned from this, it's that something can never be forgotten. Some shadows cling to you, no matter how hard you try to escape. So if you ever hear a soft tapping at your window on a stormy night, or feel a presence lurking in the darkness, don't look, don't listen. She's out there, watching, waiting. If you enjoyed the story, please smash the like button, share and subscribe to Enthrall Tales for more stories like this in the future. Thank you for watching.